From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City. On this special episode of our show, we will reflect on the life and legacy of one of the most transformative figures in modern Catholicism, Pope Francis. As the first Jesuit pope, his revolutionary approach to faith, leadership, and compassion has reshaped not only the Catholic Church, but the global religious landscape. Joining us for this conversation will be Father James Martin, a Jesuit priest, author, and close observer and friend of Pope Francis. As we honor Pope Francis's life and legacy, Father Jim offers a personal and reflective look on the leader who has inspired not only Catholics, but all those seeking a more compassionate and just world. Stay with us for this moving conversation as we celebrate the remarkable impact of Pope Francis. We need these conversations now more than ever. Please make sure you subscribe, share, and rate the State of Belief podcast at Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast platform. Our library of past conversations includes well over 100 hopeful, empowering, and inspiring interviews with guests like Bishop William Barber, Maggie Siddiqui, Congressman Jamie Raskin, and many others. You can help grow the State of Belief with a financial contribution right now. Find out how at stateofbelief.com and how you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. Father James Martin is a Roman Catholic priest, author, and speaker known for his work in bridging the gap between faith and contemporary issues. He serves as the editor-at-large for America Magazine, a national Catholic publication. His latest book is called Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle. In 2017, Pope Francis appointed Father Jim, a fellow Jesuit, to the position of consultor to the Vatican Secretariat for Communication, advising the Vatican on communication matters, particularly related to the Church's outreach to modern society and its engagement with issues of faith and culture. His appointment reflected Pope Francis's commitment to inclusive dialogue, as Father Martin has been a prominent advocate for LGBTQ plus inclusion within the Church. This position gave Father Jim the chance to meet personally and privately with Pope Francis and form impressions of both the ministry and the man. And that's why I'm grateful to have him with us on this sad occasion. Father Jim Martin, welcome back to the State of Belief.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul.
So, can you just tell me the first time that you met Pope Francis? So many people have admired this man from afar, but you actually got to meet him, and not just once, on several occasions. But what was the first time you met him?
Well, the first time I just shook his hand after a mass, and it was pretty quick, and I was a little disappointed. He barely said anything. But then a year or two later, he invited me to a papal audience, a private audience in his library in the Apostolic Palace, which is where he meets diplomats and heads of state. And so this was a sign that he wanted to let the world know that he supported LGBTQ ministry. You know, honestly, it was overwhelming. But I felt really at peace and kind of calm. I was surprised, Paul. It was, like going out, with you for dinner. I was kind of relaxed. And I think one of the reasons was he's so warm and friendly and funny. And I'll tell you a funny story. I asked a cardinal friend of mine after I was invited to this audience, well, what do I say? And he said, well, he invited you. So you ask him what he would like to talk about, which I thought was great, in Vatican kind of diplomacy. And I said, Holy Father, what would you like to talk about? And he opened his arms and said, what would you like to talk about?
Wow.
And we spent about half hour talking about LGBTQ Catholics. I thought I'd never see him again, so I figured this was my shot. And then towards the end, Paul, because I was talking all about LGBT stuff, he's very warm and encouraging and all this. Towards the end, I thought, boy, I'm kind of dominating this conversation. Maybe he would like to talk about something else. And so I said, Holy Father, is there anything I can do for you? Meaning like, would you like to talk about the American Church or the Jesuits or whatever? And he said, yes, you can continue this ministry in peace. That's what you can do for me. So it was really powerful. And I felt that as a kind of it's almost like a mission from the Pope. So, I met with him several times since then, almost every time talking about LGBT stuff. And he was always very encouraging. We exchanged notes a lot over email. I would ask him questions and suggest things. Some he would say yes to, some he would say no to. But we had a very, I wasn't his best friend, and I didn't know him as well as many others, but, we had a really friendly relationship.
So let's get into the emotion of this because, this is a moment of great transition. Um, and, you know, what is your feeling, dominant feeling on the passing of Pope Francis? And, what are some of the things that you want to make sure that, people remember about who he was when he was in the Vatican?
Well, that's a great question. Sadness, of course. Sadness on I would say, a professional level that that the Catholic Church loses a great leader. Sadness on a personal level. He was a lovely guy. He was really nice to me. And, but also gratitude that we had him as Pope for 12 years and that, I was able to be with him. I really would like to let people know a couple things. First of all, how kind he was, how funny he was, how attentive he was, how open he was to learning. I can tell a story about that later. But also for LGBTQ listeners, how he really had that community's best interests in mind. He did more than any pope, any of the other popes combined for LGBTQ people. If you don't mind, I'd like to kind of share a few kind of highlights.
I would appreciate it.
I mean, if we think about it, sometimes people say, "Oh, what did he do?" He's the first pope ever to use the word gay in public. Okay. His five most famous words in English, "Who am I to judge?" were said in response to a question about gay priests. He opposed publicly the criminalization of homosexuality. He signed that document, Fiducia Supplicans, that provided for priests to be able to bless same-sex couples under certain circumstances, which garnered him a ton of pushback. He met with people like me and Sister Janine Gramick from New Ways Ministry. He appointed an openly gay man, Juan Carlos Cruz, to a papal commission. He told parents they should never, kick out their gay children. And again, this is, and sometimes in the West, and, I would imagine most people listening to this are in the United States or in the West. And sometimes we say, well, big deal. Well, you know what? In Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa, that's a big deal. And so he really got a lot of pushback. And when he was with me, he was always encouraging, writing notes and, just saying, I keep up your ministry. He would almost always say that in notes to me, keep up your good work and I support you. And so I think it's important for people who might say, big deal. He was nice to gay people. When we think about that from the United States, it might seem a little tepid, but in other parts of the world, it was white hot. And so he
Yeah.
really stepped out. And so those are the kinds of things I'd like people to remember.
It's totally important. And, just something that we should all recognize as we're thinking about his legacy. It's wonderful. Who am I to judge? I was looking, somehow something came up on my, a photo from my past. And I had on this huge T-shirt of Pope Francis and just those words. And, you were with me at during my HuffPost days.
Right.
You were one of the most prolific writers that we worked together so much there. And I'm just, I'm recalling the whole thing with Pope Benedict stepping down and what a moment that was in journalism and what moment it was, I'm sure for Catholic believers, there was something, totally disruptive happening. And then all of the mechanism of going through and finding this new pope. And, a lot of us had never heard of him. And so he's introduced into the main stage. And the fact that he took Francis.
Yeah.
I mean, can we talk a little bit about that and Pope Francis's commitment to the poor and the outcast in all that entails?
Well, sure. And, as a Jesuit, he is the first pope in centuries to be a member of a religious order and pope, which means he took a vow of poverty, which meant he lived very simply. But there's a story, which is true, that before he was always very devoted to the poor. He lived simply as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. But there's a story that sitting next to him during the conclave was Cardinal Umes, I think you say, who was a Brazilian cardinal. And immediately after he was elected, Cardinal Umes turned to him and said, "Don't forget the poor." And that, I think, inspired him to take the name Francis after Francis of Assisi.
Can we
And
just stop there for just 1 second?
sure,
Because that is
yeah,
like, that's almost like, whether you're Catholic, whether you're Protestant, whether you're Orthodox, no matter what tradition you come from, if you're actually trying to follow in Jesus's footsteps, the mandate, don't forget the poor,
yeah.
is about as Jesus as you can get.
Well,
And I just, I've heard that story. I'm so glad for you to like confirm it, because it's been confirmed to me before. But just thinking about Pope Francis and his legacy and who he was, I always come back to that story. Remember the poor. And that's like, in some ways, a prism to understanding what he tried to accomplish during his time as Pope.
I totally agree. And a pope's first big decision is what name is he going to take, and that kind
Right.
of is the sort of programmatic, stance for him. But interestingly, he was known among Jesuits as not always very progressive or open-minded, because among the Jesuits, he had been a Jesuit provincial or regional superior when he was very young and was very doctrinaire and quite rigid and quite my way or the highway. And he changed. And for about a day or two, there was some consternation among Jesuits about, well, who is this guy that, was so rigid and pretty kind of right wing when he was a Jesuit provincial. But it was, I think, on the second or third day, that he gave a talk before the Vatican press corps. And I remember he had a sheaf of papers in his hand. And he said, "How I want a church that is poor and for the poor." And I thought, oh boy, this is okay. Now I think I know who we're getting. But you're
But
right, Paul. That name really sort of was the that was kind of the signs of the times that people needed to see that this is where this guy's going.
Oh my God. And then, again, like my prism was both like curiosity as a religious person who's in, and who cares about theology and the way we talk about, Jesus and the mission. To see him, I think this was in the first couple of weeks, to see him washing the feet of immigrants.
Mm.
This was on Maundy Thursday. And so Holy Week, I don't remember exactly the chronology, but it wasn't long after. And so
No, it wasn't.
it was so I'm just going back to those times where we were like, every action revealed more and
Yeah.
more about who this leader was. And let me tell you, it's one of those things where you, Christians, non-Christians, Catholics, non-Catholics, everybody looked at that and said, oh, wait, now I remember what Christians are supposed to be doing. Now I remember what Jesus is. I mean, it was really like, I'm not trying to be like, gushing or anything, but it was one of those things. And journalistically, it was wild. People were
Well,
so fascinated with this person.
yeah.
And it recognized like the hunger for people to have authentic religious people in the public arena. I mean, it just felt like he was stepping into a void that a lot of people felt.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, as we know, you're a theologian, Jesus taught in the Gospels with words and deeds, right? And his deeds
Right.
gave meaning to his words, and his words gave meaning to his deeds, and it all fit together. And Francis taught a lot in gestures. And you're right, those images of him washing the feet of immigrants. Also, you'll remember that I think the first trip he took outside of Rome was to the island of Lampedusa, where he celebrated Mass for refugees on an overturned boat that had been used to, like a vessel, to ferry migrants back and forth. And the other image I remember was the fellow who had that sort of disfiguring skin condition, who came up to him and he hugged him. And I remember thinking at the time, boy, I hope we have this guy at least for a year, because he was elderly and who knew. But 12 years of this, and he really sort of put his money where his mouth was. And, he
Yeah.
went all over the world, and he was and my experience with him, let me tell you a story. When I was at the Synod, which was this worldwide gathering of Catholics it met twice, once in October 2023, once in October 2024. He was there most days, and most days in this big hall in Vatican City near St. Peter's. He would be there early, and he would be in the wheelchair, and he would be at 8:30 greeting a whole line of people, each of whom wanted their moment with him. Right? So, Holy Father, I brought you this book that I wrote about whatever. Holy Father, can you record a greeting to my theology class back in Micronesia? Holy Father, I brought you this gift. I brought you this food. Can you pray with me? Or bishops and cardinals, I need to talk to you. He'd have a line of people. At 11 o'clock, when we had our coffee break, another line of people. And at 4 o'clock, when we were finishing, and 7:30, when we were finishing, another line of people. And I swear this is true, every single person got attention. I didn't see one, I know this sounds crazy. I didn't see one moment where he was like, oh my gosh, I got to get home, or I'm tired. Attentive, really seeing God in each person. And I thought that was just amazing. And this is his pastoral style. And he just sort of poured himself out for everybody.
Yeah.
I've never seen
Yeah.
anything like it. I mean, I would have been like, oh my gosh,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
time for me to go
Yeah,
home.
yeah, exactly. Up next, much more with Father Jim Martin as we remember Pope Francis. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. Make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. Today we are honoring the life and legacy of Pope Francis with Father Jim Martin. Talk to us a little bit about the encyclicals, because that was another piece of, he wasn't just kind of going out there and doing and praying, but he was actually putting out some really important ideas, including around the environment, around the poor, and, speaking actually into, something very near and dear to my heart, the interfaith relations. And so could you talk a little bit about, the legacy of his writing and what he put into the world as Pope?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's overlooked. And in addition to the encyclicals, are a number of books that he wrote or interviews, and, which is a lot of them were about, his own faith journey and questions of faith. But the one that I would focus on would be Laudato Si, which was his encyclical on the environment, on care for our common home, which I love that phrase. And, I think before that, obviously religious people and spiritual people had talked about climate change as an issue. But he really, I think definitively, at least in the Catholic Church, moved it from simply a scientific question and a political question to a spiritual question. That's what he did in that encyclical. And really the insight was everything is connected. Everything is connected. And to your point, Paul, he reminded people that the people who suffer most from climate change are the poor, right? And so that's one reason it is an especially important moral question. And then in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which was about brotherhood, right? He said everyone is connected. I think that's how you can summarize both of those encyclicals. But Laudato Si to me is just, let me share one part that I thought was really beautiful. He has, and you read these obviously as spiritual documents. And when I was reading it, I thought, I've never thought about this. And just something simple that I think you'd enjoy too. He says that, when Jesus was walking through, the environment in Galilee and Judea, that he wasn't just using things from nature in his parables, like kind of instrumentally. He actually enjoyed nature, which I really never thought of. Like as he walked through nature, he enjoyed it. I thought that was so beautiful.
Isn't that wonderful?
And so, it's like, it's just so there's so many insights he has. And, in this, he did a foreword to my book, Come Forth, which you mentioned on Lazarus. and just insights he has. One of the things he says was, get this, Scripture and the Bible as God's love letter to us.
Huh.
So I just thought that's so beautiful. So there are these
Oh,
wonderful
yeah.
insights and aperçu and it's just kind of
I think that
spiritual
even just
gems.
saying even that, and how wonderful that you have that as just like that, you to have Pope Francis write a forward on your
Yeah.
book is just incredible. But the idea of Scripture as a love letter, given especially your work, where Scripture is so often used as a hammer, as
Oh
like
yeah.
to flip it and say that Scripture is not meant, if it's dealing death, you're doing it wrong. And
Right.
so, I just think, like, even just that offering, and especially in the context of your beautiful book, one of the remarkable, I don't know how to even call it, like, interactions in the last weeks of his life were just, we had this odd situation where a very fervent Catholic, who is our vice president, J.D. Vance, who was, attacking the Catholic bishops for their work with the poor, with the migrants. I mean, very in line with what Pope Francis really put as his own emphasis and his, clearly his heart. And he said that they were only interested in the bottom line. And then he went on to kind of offer this theological treatise and kind of lecturing the Catholic bishops on what the concentric circles of care should look like. And, talk to me about how that felt in that moment, but then also this, maybe we can get into a little bit, like, as we look towards the future, and perhaps a future pope, what is how in this moment of unrest and uncertainty, how does that play into this moment, thinking about the legacy and then turning towards the future?
When I heard JD Vance's comments, I was really disturbed. The first one is a sort of misinterpretation of, as you know, this sort of idea called the Ordo Amoris, which comes from actually Aristotle and Augustine and then Thomas Aquinas, which basically says you love your closest to you first, your family, and then supposedly your neighbors, and then your community, and then maybe other people. And Aquinas was not using this as something that is kind of a should. You should do this, and therefore you only have a little love left for strangers. As if it's kind of a zero-sum game. We had a couple great articles about that on America. That's false. And Jesus says, you know, I was a stranger and you did not welcome me, or I was a stranger, you did welcome me. It's not like it. So it was really a false way of presenting Catholic teaching. And I think using Thomas Aquinas to basically say or imply you don't need to take care of strangers. Even worse, truly. I mean, I thought, well, all right, maybe he misinterpreted that. Maybe that's his way of looking at that particular question. Even worse was accusing the bishops of making money off of migrants. And look, if you just want the dollars and cents, they took in 129 million donations for migrants. They spent 130 million. So the U.S. Bishops Conference is not making money off of migrants. And I mean, it's a lie, basically. We have to be honest about that. And to say that and to put that into people's heads, and as you know, that gets into people's heads and that gets into the popular discourse, was just awful. And then at the same time, to be cutting USAID, which is now
Right.
gone, where people are going to die. And to do this and to say that this is being done, as a Christian or as a Catholic, I thought was really reprehensible. Like I said, you can argue with his interpretation of the Order Amoris and all right, Aquinas and all that, but to lie about the bishops was unbelievable to me. And as a Catholic, to do that is just unbelievable. And fortunately, the bishops pushed back. And then finally, Pope Francis pushed back, right, and wrote a very brief letter to the U.S. bishops supporting their work with migrants and against mass deportation, and also reminding us that the real sort of template or ethos is not the order amoris, it's the Good Samaritan, it's Jesus. So I was glad he did that.
Well, I mean, that's major. Like
Yeah.
literally, like more Catholic than the Pope is like a phrase that we used to like joke about. But
Yes.
literally, J.D. Vance thinks he's more Catholic than the Pope. And I'm not giving him that permission slip. I think it's just really important to see how out of line he was, but how it gives permission. Like you say, it's in the atmosphere now, and it's poison. And so, but I mean, it's amazing that Pope Francis felt the need, because of the gravity of the misinterpretation and the gravity of the accusations, to speak back.
Well,
And it just goes to, again, to his last days, how committed he was to that.
well, and it was always a big issue for him, migrants and refugees, and also, uh, he understands the U.S. Church. He understood the U.S. Church, I would say. I mean, when I was with him, he understood exactly what was going on. He understood what needed to be done. But can I tell a story that really, I think, shows you what an amazing guy he was? And for me, this story really kind of sums up everything. And it's about just how open he was. Very briefly, you probably remember last year he made a comment to the Italian Bishops' Conference about the sort of over prevalence of gay priests in the priesthood and in seminaries, and used a slur word, which I can never say, which is basically, I won't say it, it's like
Yeah, yeah,
effeminacy or
yeah,
frogacine. And anyway, and I was really surprised by this. And I thought, this is so out of character from the guy that I know. And it really made headlines, and it made a lot of LGBTQ people upset. In any event, I was over there a couple months later for a meeting with comedians that I was asked to sort of help to arrange with the Pope, which went very well. So I'm over there, and he agrees to meet with me, and I bring this up. I bring up the slur that he used, and I bring up the question about gay priests, and he says to me right off the bat, "Well, of course I know many holy and faithful and celibate gay priests and seminarians. You know that, and I've told you that." And I said, "Well, maybe it would be good for you to say that publicly." And he said, this is how he talks. He said, this is in Spanish with the translator. He said, "Well, you can say that." And I said, "Wait a minute. I can say that you know many gay priests and seminarians who are holy and gay and celibate. Of course you can say that." And I said to the translator, "Did he?" And the translator said, "Yeah, he just said you can say that." And he said, "Of course you can say that because I do believe that." And then we had a discussion about the slur, which apparently he didn't understand the gravity of. And he said, and I'm never going to use it again. Right? Okay. So, and then we moved on to other stuff, the U.S. Church and all sorts of things. All right. That's part one. Part two is, I'm at this meeting with all the comedians, and everyone's going up to get their hands shook, whatever. And I wait in the back because I thought I just saw him, so I don't need to see him again. So I go up, he laughs, and he says, "Oh, so now you're a famous American comedian, huh?" And then I laugh, and I swear, and there's video of this. I start to pull away. He pulls me back and says, "Thank you for that meeting the other day.
Mm.
I really needed to hear that. That was so helpful." And then gave me a thumbs up. And I just thought, Paul, who does that? Who thanks people for a difficult meeting? Who thanks people for being corrected? And it's someone who's holy and open and humble. That's true humility for me, and listening. And I thought this was one of his secrets. In addition to God's grace, that was one of his secrets. Who does that?
Yeah,
So it was
yeah.
so moving. That little throwaway thing, and I'm glad I have the little video of it, was just so amazing to me. And not like, "Oh, hey, okay, I got what you were saying. Thank you.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
needed that." So
Yeah.
that's who he was.
No, that's I know there's only certain moments when the Pope is infallible, but someone who like actually has the ability to say, "And now I'm being infallible," like to say I was fallible there. And, I
Yep.
mean, in some ways, and being really, I actually think that's a great story to talk about who he was, and this is what great leadership is. Religious
Yes.
leadership but leadership of any kind is to recognize, oh, okay, I can grow here. I can learn here. It reminds me of a professor of mine, Jim Cohn, who was a professor of
Oh,
Black
yeah.
liberation theology at Union. And he wrote his big book, really important book on Black liberation. And then women came to him and said, you're really not thinking about us at all. And then he was like, you're right. Let me think about, let's figure out how ways I can get better. And
Yeah.
not being intimidated, and up to the point
Yes.
where Jim Cohn was very interested in LGBTQ rights. He was always about Black rights and Black liberation, but he realized he could learn, and we could all learn.
Yeah.
And boy, how much I've had to learn over the years. But that Pope Francis, was still learning. Even at that late time, it's a testimony to what hopefully we can inspire religious leadership to incorporate that idea into what leadership means today.
I hope so. And I learned a lot from him. I mean, one of the things I
Yeah,
learned was that change takes time.
right.
And, he said to me once, I proposed something kind of dramatic, which I won't say, about LGBT stuff. And he said, I prefer to go step by step so as not to cause a chain reaction, meaning like a big pushback and having it blow up in your face. And I thought, you know what? He's right. I mean, it's important to be prophetic, but he was also about unity in the church. So I just was so, I was so lucky to know him.
Yeah,
And it was such a blessing. And look, I'll have to say, I'm not a cardinal. I'm not an archbishop. I'm not a bishop. I'm not president of a university. I'm not a provincial of some. I'm just me. I just write books and do my little work. I'm not some. So for him to meet with me several times was amazing for me. So
yeah.
really a huge blessing.
Well, and thank you, because those of us who are part of the LGBTQ community, but part of the broader Christian community, and the bravery that you have every time you speak publicly. And a lot of people who consider themselves Catholic come out to protest you, and in really terrible ways. And yet for you to feel like you had literally the Pope's blessing, I mean, that must have given you
Yeah,
a great deal of comfort. Can you say just,
totally.
yeah, I mean, that must have been like, yeah, you can come for me, man. Yeah.
Well, but I mean, he is my boss technically. I mean, he's
Right.
my boss. I'm
Yeah.
a Jesuit. I take a vow of obedience. There's a superior general of our Jesuits, and he supports me. I mean, I tell him what I'm doing, but his boss is the Pope, so
Yeah.
it did make
Right.
a huge difference.
Right. Right. So just, in these moments that are uncertain for the future, what do you imagine happening with uh, uh, the church going forward? I mean, Pope Francis
Well,
was a
we'll
change from
see. We'll
Pope
see who is
Benedict, and
elected Pope. We'll see who's
yeah,
elected Pope. That's a big. I would encourage people to give the new Pope, whoever he is, a chance. I think you'll get a little bit of an idea of where he's going by the choice of his name,
mm,
and we'll see. As we're recording it, we don't know who the new Pope is, and I think there are lots of interesting candidates. Interestingly, for those people who watch the movie Conclave, that's pretty accurate. That's sort of what happens. The different factions and different desires, and it's not quite as dramatic with. I don't want to ruin conclave, but that gives you a good sense of what the process is like. But really, to give the new pope a chance, I would say.
Father James Martin has been consultor to the Vatican Secretariat for Communication since 2017, appointed by Pope Francis. Father Jim is editor-at-large for America Magazine and has written about a gazillion books, all of which are amazing. The most recent is Come Forth. Jim, I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate you being willing to talk to me and to our listeners on the state of belief, and sharing all that you know about, or sharing all that you knew about Pope Francis, but also all the work that you did with him. And so just want to end with a note of deep appreciation for you and for Pope Francis.
Well, thank you, Paul, for being such a supporter and an advocate and a brother, and it was wonderful being on with you.
Please share the State of Belief with people in your networks that would benefit from hearing this conversation. And subscribe to the State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to keep making the State of Belief. Please make a financial contribution today at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us each week. I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.